So our next stop in the evolution of drum set and drum set playing is the year 1917. Now this was the year that a band from New Orleans called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band went up to New York City and made some recordings that became huge hits all over the country. And the style that they were playing was a style from New Orleans, and it sort of kicked off what we call jazz music. It was really the first official jazz recordings. So jazz, if you know your history at all, is a style that does indeed come from New Orleans. And there's a lot of bands in New Orleans at the time that were making this kind of music. And it was kind of cool because a lot of the things that we've talked about so far in our discussion of at various points along the way here in our journey are now coming together. So from a drumming perspective, you have guys like Baby Dodds and Zutty Singleton, Ray Baduke, a guy named Tony Sparbaro, who was the drummer in the Original Dixieland Jazz Band. And what they're doing is taking this idea of marching, right, that we talked about, but now combining your bass drum and your snare drum and some of these, what were called traps from these different immigrant groups that were coming in, little cymbals, little tom-toms, woodblocks, cowbells. And they started bringing all that together with this rudimental style of playing and combining it with ragtime, which had been popular for a couple of decades now, which was more syncopated and more swinging. So now drumming really starts to move away from the rudimental thing and kind of turn into its own little thing, jazz drumming style. So that's all happening around this time period. Now our drum set has grown just a little bit to add some of these elements known as traps. And we could point some of them out. Certainly woodblock, which originated actually in China and Korea. Cowbell, which is used in a lot of cultures. This is a Turkish type of a cymbal. It's actually an old Zildjian cymbal, and the Zildjian family came to the States in the early 20th century. So they were one of those immigrant groups. So this is an early example of their cymbal. And we have a Chinese cymbal here, actually made in China. It's a newer one. It's not a vintage one, but this is, typical of what Chinese cymbals still look like today. China cymbals, they've got that inside-out garbage can look. So the early drum set players from New Orleans would incorporate all of these kind of elements into what they were playing. Now, how did they play? Well, they took a lot of those rudiments and they started swinging them. And maybe before you'd have a nice, clean, open roll, shagadagadap, would now become da-jizhup, jizhup. So it become more of a press roll, and that sort of was more swinging and, again, made people want to dance. So we still have our two-feel kind of military thing going on. We don't have any hi-hats yet or big toms or ride or crash cymbals, but we've got these smaller kind of noise-making effects, and drummers would start to play fills on these. They were called fill-ins. So here's a little demonstration of what New Orleans drumming might have sounded like back at the time. So far in this series, we've spanned quite a few decades now looking at all kinds of different stuff about the evolution of the drum set. We've looked at double drumming, marching drumming, ragtime music, traps, and early jazz, New Orleans jazz. So now we're moving forward to 1919, just on the cusp of the 1920s. And as most of you know, the 1920s are often known as the Roaring Twenties, right? So what was going on that gave them this name, and how does that relate to this music we're talking about and to the drums? Well, in 1919, the U.S. Congress passed a law called Prohibition, which meant that it prohibited people from manufacturing and transporting alcohol for drinking, because there was a lot of moralistic complaints that drinking was evil and let's get rid of this evil scourge on society. But usually what happens when you tell someone that they can't do something? The first thing they're going to do is run right out and do as much of that as they can, right? So all of a sudden, drinking becomes the cool thing to do. But because it's illegal, it kind of goes underground. And so the 1920s is called the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties because everyone decided to go crazy and party it up. And because drinking was illegal, you had the rise in cities like Chicago, but many other cities, as well, of gangsters. You hear of Al Capone and guys like that. And the reason they came to prominence and power is because they were manufacturing and bootlegging liquor illegally. And places where people would go to drink liquor were called speakeasies a lot of times. These were underground establishments. You had to have the password to get in. And when you'd go in, you could drink. And so what kind of music are you going to have at these places? Well, you're going to have jazz music because jazz music was also underground, illegal. It had been, created and put forward. It was an African-American style. And of course, we lived in a very segregated nation at that time. And again, it was not upstanding to enjoy African-American music. So if you went to one of these speakeasies in the 20s, you'd see African-American jazz being played. You'd drink illegal liquor. It was very exciting. And of course, great dancing, and jazz was great music to dance to in this time period. And jazz is starting to evolve now. It's been around for maybe 10 years, and so the bands are getting a little more sophisticated. We're adding more horns. We're building bigger arrangements, and we start heading towards what was going to be called the big band. So check it out. Here's a little bit more about what 1920s Chicago-style jazz is all about. So in both the New Orleans demonstration that I did in the previous segment and the Chicago demonstration that you just saw, you might notice that the way that I'm playing the fills is a little different than how we play fills today, right? The way we play fills today, generally we come down the tom-toms, crash. So we crash on beat 1 at the beginning of the following phrase. But the way I was playing here, we crashed on beat 4. So I'd be playing along 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is the way that fills were played and ended back in this early period. In fact, drummers ended their fills on beat 4 all the way until we get into the 1950s, believe it or not. And the reason for this was that you have to remember that drums were very loud, the rest of the band was soft and acoustic, and if a drummer crashed on beat 1, it was considered rude, as if you were stepping on the other instruments in the band. So that's why this sort of idea of crashing on beat 4 came from. And it also comes from a New Orleans syncopated idea, which so there was a stress on beat 4 there. So as a result of those two kind of combination of ideas, drummers always played their crashes on beat 4. In our last segment, we were talking about the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, and how jazz had kind of really evolved as more of a popular art form, but it was happening with the gangsters and the speakeasies and all that kind of thing. So that's in terms of drummers playing jazz music. But just like today, here in the 21st century, drummers have a lot of different things that they can do. So a lot of us out here are what we call freelance drummers, and we maybe one day are playing a show, and the next day we're playing a concert, and the next day we're doing a theater thing, and the next day we're playing in a club, and the next day we're playing for dancers. So there's a lot of different things that you could do, and drummers back then had the same sort of roles. They would take on many different roles. So we haven't really talked too much about this, but one of the really most important roles of a drummer in the 1920s was as what they call a Foley artist today, meaning a sound effects person. And you have to remember, this was back at a time period when you didn't have, you had radio at this point, but you didn't have TV, you certainly didn't have computers. And you had movies, but the movies were silent movies. The technology wasn't there yet to have a soundtrack go along with the movie. So when a movie would come to a theater, either they would have a piano player, or in some of the bigger cities, and as the 1920s progressed and things got more sophisticated, they would have an entire orchestra backing up a silent movie. And it fell to the drummer in the band, or drummers, sometimes there'd be several of them, to provide all the sound effects. So if there was a gunshot, if there was a plane flying overhead, if a baby was crying, if there was a cow mooing, or a bird chirping, or a train coming into the station, or horses galloping, or somebody shooting somebody, or somebody bending over and their pants ripping, well, the drummer was responsible for all of this. And this got to be pretty sophisticated. And you could see sheet music from the period, and there would be all kinds of cues for what instrument a drummer had to play. And so like today, drummers had to have pretty large setups in these theater circumstances. Or if it was a radio show, they were, somebody was listening, the drummer was providing all of this filler, this background sound effects to bring the radio production to life. So what you're about to see next is something that probably you're not going to see anywhere today. This is the one and only place to check this out. And it's a demonstration done by William F. Ludwig III, who is the grandson of the founder of the Ludwig Drum Company, the original William F. Ludwig. Now we already talked about in an earlier segment that William F. Ludwig and his brother were the ones that invented the bass drum pedal design that we still use today. And of course, we all know that they also created the Ludwig Drum Company. But prior to getting into that, William F. Ludwig was a champion rudimental drummer, and he toured all over the country and was one of the most important theater drummers in the Chicago area. So his grandson, William F. Ludwig III, has inherited all of his grandfather's traps and noisemakers, and he's going to do a demonstration for you right now of what it was like for a trap drummer, either in a silent movie or a stage show or a radio show back in the 1920s.
My grandfather and his brother, William F. Ludwig Sr. and Theobald Ludwig, started out the drum company by having an actual drum shop that they would do repairs and help people tune their drums and keep them operating properly. As time went on, people would come to them with certain needs and say, I need this sound, or I need this drum to do this, or this piece of equipment. And so they became inventors of sound effects, which we have here today. In those days, before sound, the drummers were behind the screen watching the movie and doing the various sound effects along with the movie to make it more entertaining for the audience. One of our items that we have is the gunshot sound effect. And this actually holds .22 caliber blank shells. And then you close this down, have it on the table, and strike it with a hammer or drumstick or whatever you have handy. The train effect is really interesting because it's so simple but effective, and then they even added this on as a separate item. You could get it with or without the bell, which I thought was pretty interesting. But this has a series of door springs inside. This looks like it was some kind of a file of some sort that they just saw it and picked it up and said, let's try that, and it worked. And that's the way he did most everything. That just slides in there, and then you go, if you're starting, if the train is just starting out, let's say, and you can increase the volume, speed, to really give the true effect of a train departing. And they also had to build items that could be transported because these percussionists were going from theater to theater. It wasn't always the same theater. Different train whistle, a boat whistle. So in the movie script, we say the sheriff rode into town, and these are the horse's hoofs that create that sound effect. And also, we say that the sheriff, when he arrived in town, went by the blacksmith's shop where he was shoeing a horse. And then he goes by the schoolhouse and hears the bell tolling. Then also, as the script continues with the Clancy brothers getting off the train, when the train stops, a dog nervously barks in the distance. Might have been a little ill at the time, but nevertheless, it's a dog. And we also have another sound effect that I don't have with me that's a large version of this. It's about this big around, it's on the floor, and you pull the cloth up on that, and it's a lion roar. So it's the same concept, just a little deeper. This is just a hollow metal cylinder with a type of head on it, and you just slide a cloth over the string. Along those lines of the whistles, we also have the basic siren and duck call. Which has been around forever. But these are all the tools of the trade of the percussionist in the silent movie era. And this rather odd-looking item is a cuckoo clock, which always comes in handy. And then, of course, the cricket sound.